Welcome to Season 2 of the Project Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer. As many of you know, I am a cult survivor myself. For anyone interested, you can hear the story of how I got in and how I got out in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. The beginning of this year, 2023, actually marks my 11 years of being out, and I am so super grateful for the ways my life has unfolded since. I now work with survivors of coercive control, and I'm going to take a moment here to define this term, as one of my heart's desires is to help society at large better understand coercive control in cases that are not just culty, but across the globe I view coercive control as a social issue. It's at the heart of cases where women and girls are murdered. We find coercive control in one-to-one relationships that are intimate, in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults of all types. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and I'm just beginning a new element of my career as an expert witness for legal cases that involve coercive control. As a certified trauma professional, I work with survivors. I'm especially excited to be offering a group survivor program for cult and religious abuse recovery. So this is not a support group, but rather a healing program. It's based on my certification in the incredible work of Dr. Jilly Jenkinson, who gathered decades of research on survivors to create a body of work that I would consider to be the most comprehensive and flexible approach I've come across in this field. We will meet every other week for 6 months, and registration will open in February of 2023 for those interested. Lastly, I am also a research associate at Salford University and explore topics related to coercive control. So let's jump back into a basic understanding of coercive control before I introduce the next episode. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. The victim's everyday existence is micromanaged, and their space for action, as well as potential as a human being, is limited and controlled by the abuser. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Then gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. The abuser creates an unreal world of contradiction, confusion, and fear. It may be helpful to know that 51% of victims do not even know that they are being abused, manipulated, and controlled. Coercive control correlates significantly to serious harm, and in many cases, in intimate partner violence, it precedes homicide. These can be difficult topics to grapple with, so I truly hope that this podcast helps to protect you and those you love with helpful voices and information. If you appreciate the podcast, please let us know by subscribing and comment with kindness. And always think critically, trust your intuition, and be free. Welcome back to the Project Hope podcast. I'm very excited to share this episode with you all. It's a very special episode for me personally because it centers around the topic of consent. You will likely get a sense as you listen to this interview just how important defining the word consent is for legislation and for the protection of us as humans. If we define consent, we take care of so many efforts of others who care about certain causes that we try to address from that particular standpoint, when simply defining consent would create a foundation that can hold perpetrators accountable in so many of these circumstances that people are working hard in their silos to address. This is why I'm such a fan, supporter, and advocate for the work that the Consent Awareness Network is doing to get consent defined in our law as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. So I want to introduce you to two of the key players in this movement, Joyce Short and Nina Lucas. Joyce Short is the founder and chief executive of the Consent Awareness Network and a TEDx Talk Presenter. She's a sexual assault survivor and the author of 4 books that can turn our human right to consent into a civil right backed by law. She has been an expert witness and the architect of several legislative bills that can radically change how consent is dealt with by our justice system. She has been featured on Nightline, CBS News, BuzzFeed, Inside Edition, The New York Times, and more. And she's been quoted in books and journals, including The Moment by Andrea Constand, and has been honored as a Woman of Distinction by the New York State Assembly. Nina Lucas serves as Chief of Staff and a Consent Outreach Ambassador for the Consent Awareness Network. She is also a member of Never Alone Advocacy, which was founded to fight back against abuse of the power in the military. As a classically trained singer, Nina's secret superpower is opera, and she is dedicated to applying her robust voice to inform, educate, and empower however she can in all efforts to codify consent. Between this interview and its release, Joyce's book called Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault has been re-released as a revised edition, so please check it out. And I'll say a few things about the book. Firstly, it's a really quick read. And the reason I mention this is because it is so accessible as a resource that all women, men, and young people should have. In a really concise way, Joyce guides us through why sexual assault is an underreported and under-prosecuted crime. She clearly uncomplicates consent by explaining with real-life examples why non-consensual sex is sexual assault. She clarifies that consent is ineffective if induced by force, duress, or deception. And Joyce defines 3 distinct types of agreement, which I'll do some social media posting about. She also guides us through how consent should apply in the penal code. It's important for all women, but in particular, younger women, to educate themselves on our history, how we've arrived where we have, and why. These are the keys to our personal and societal empowerment to change systems that have an impact on our morality. What I'm fondly now calling this little big book, little because of the size and big because of the impact it could have and the scope it covers. But it also shares how you can keep yourself, your loved ones, and society safe from sexual assault. So in just about 30 pages, you'll have an understanding that might lead you to want to take action. If that's the case, we welcome you to support the efforts of the Consent Awareness Network by signing the petition for New York legislation. You will find it in my link tree or in the show notes. And of course, please follow Joyce and Nina on social media. They, of course, also have links to the petition in their information. It is so important that we define consent as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution grants us all equal protection under the law. But we can't get equal protection when the very word determining guilt or innocence changes from one jury to the next. As an example, consent appears 162 times in the New York State's Penal Code, yet each jury is instructed to create its own meaning. This literally turns our justice system's ability to hold sex offenders accountable into, as Joyce puts it, a crapshoot. So please get involved in a way that works for you. We have Joyce's TEDx talk in the show notes. You're also welcome to donate to the Consent Awareness Network, and we'll find a link for that as well. So finally, I want to thank both Nina and Joyce for their amazing work toward the furtherment of our society as one that upholds equality and human rights by seeking to have consent defined in our laws. I also appreciate that these two have partnered with me to speak to the impact that defining consent might have beyond sexual assault and into the realm of groups that manipulate members to mentally entrap them, a dynamic based in coercive control, and therefore with similar threads you might identify in unhealthy domestic situations. My hope is that defining consent will also help us in cases of cultic or spiritual abuse, which to date we have a very difficult time achieving accountability for the perpetrator of this type of non-consensual psychological abuse. Cases that hold cult leaders accountable typically become cases that are won due to charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, child abuse, or other clearly defined illegal activity. But at the core of it all is the way a leader tricks the believers into consent, which, as we know, is not consent at all. It's consent that may seem freely given, but it is not knowledgeable, and it is not informed agreement. So to Nina and Joyce, I thank you for the incredible work you do, and I appreciate your time with us on the Project Hope podcast. So today I have two very special guests and advocates, and I would like to introduce you all to Joyce Short and Nina Lucas. Thank you so much for joining us on the Project Hope podcast today.
We're thrilled to be here.
Absolutely.
I've been jumping up and down to get consent in the mainstream of society's thought process for over a dozen years. And I'm really delighted to see that it's finally made its way in, and with good reason.
Well, anything and everything I can do to advocate for that, Joyce. You have got me as a support system. So, well, I wanted to just begin by asking you both kind of how you got into consent advocacy, as much or as little as you'd like to share. Whoever would like to go first.
Nina?
Sure.
Yeah.
I am a survivor of coercively controlled marriage. And my ex was a very prominent person that had a lot of access. So I was, diminished in that relationship. And of course, at the time, I didn't know the term coercive control. And indeed, I don't even think it was in the lexicon. So I didn't have a framework with which to understand what was going on, how to react, etc. So I escaped that. And then subsequently, years later, I was involved in a relationship with another, prominent person in the military. And let's just say I experienced a catastrophic consent violation there. And so when the second one happened, I remember vowing on that very day when it became apparent to me what was going on, that I wanted to do something. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I felt very strongly about fighting back, speaking up. I didn't want this to happen to anyone. And so I really started a search. First, I reached out to the military, who were very dismissive. They didn't want to entertain what I was saying. And that was very, of course, disappointing. I then reached out to, I got some legal counsel. And in both of these instances, I became very aware that there was nothing I could do because of the bad legal language that, first of all, was in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And secondly, in my state or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there is no definition of consent in the penal code, which we, have amplified through the Cosby case, when the jury asked, what is the definition of consent? And they were informed by the judge, that is a question that cannot be answered. Use your common sense. So very, very tenaciously, I kept up with it, and I found the work of Joyce. And I always say, when I did, and I started to, read her work, that I had a eureka moment. And I said, this is it. This is the issue. This is the problem. This has to be rectified. We have to educate people because, as you probably know, Jennifer, people don't know this. They don't know that we are not protected. They don't know that consent is not properly defined in the law. When I speak to peers of mine or contacts, they're always shocked. And when we speak to lawmakers, legislators that we have meetings with, they don't even know that consent is not defined in the law in a way that, their laws are just not dealing with it in the proper manner. So that's where how I came to working with the Consent Awareness Network. And I think we've been working together for about 4 years, Joyce. And this is my life's work now. And I'm very pleased to be a part of this movement.
It's so amazing. Thank you so much, Nina. I also just learned some new things, and it's quite incredible to me also that your case in particular taps into the military element of things. So often our focus is really law enforcement, not that that's maybe not connected, but it's an interesting another element to this large picture. And of course, you mentioned, coercive control, and it's so true, such a difficult thing to even recognize what's happening when you're in it, let alone once you're out and trying to make sense of it. I love the way that Jess Hill, the Australian investigative journalist who also wrote See What You Made Me Do and had a series by the same title, she refers to it as like a spider web of entrapment that you just can't even see. I love that metaphor because it's like, it's just so confusing until you actually understand it. And that's about, some serious education. So
yeah, you can't make sense of it. Absolutely
and I
not.
too, really had a similar experience as you, Nina, when I first came across Joyce's work, which of course is why I'm with the two of you, where I just kind of went, I've got this whole focus around coercive control and a master's in the psychology of coercive control. And when I came across your consent work, I just thought, this is the way to go. I mean, yes, let's keep bringing to the forefront education around what coercive control is. We have got to do that, right? Because we also know that almost all sexual assault is preceded by coercive controlling behavior. So if we really understand that, we can track, murders before they happen, because there is always coercive control that accompanies that kind of behavior. Joyce, please share with us a little bit about how you got into consent advocacy.
Sure. Well, I think like most survivors, it takes a survivor to kind of figure things out. And oftentimes we want to make sure that the rest of society is not experiencing the same harm and injury that we experienced. And so I endeavored to figure out what had happened to me. I was actually sexually assaulted in 3 different ways. I was sexually assaulted through force, through duress, otherwise known as coercive control, and also through deception. And Larry Nassar, a perfect example of deception. So after being sexually assaulted in 3 different ways and not really having a chance to understand, because at that time, there was no discussion, there was no Me Too, there was not even an internet. And it was pretty difficult to actually get a sense of what had transpired. But as a person who is a writer and goes headlong into analysis, when I write, I determined to research what the issues were. And I found that in all of sexual assault, you're being deprived of your consent. And I looked at and analyzed through Nuremberg Code, through Model Penal Code, through well, at the time, GDPR did not exist, but was able to determine what the definition for consent actually should be. And in fact, recently we did a little bit more research and even found that the definition for consent has been with us through canon law. So it's been passed down through the ages, but nobody in our justice system recognizes or understands what, certainly our laws don't support what consent is. And it's absolutely essential that we understand what consent is and that we're defining it correctly in our laws so that we can secure justice for people that are the victims of crime and hold people accountable. And it isn't strictly sexual assault or domestic violence. It's not specific to coercive control. When we actually researched the bill that we were introducing in New York, we found that the word consent is in the statutes of New York in their penal code 162 times. So if you're experiencing arson, or if your child is kidnapped, if you've been robbed, all of these things have to do with consent. And consent, very simply, is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. It's not rocket science. It's really very, very simple. And unfortunately, our laws look like a Swiss cheese umbrella full of legal loopholes, because instead of actually defining consent, what our lawmakers have done is identified very specific types of crimes. And if the crime that happens to you because you did not consent doesn't fall within the written statute that is specific to that particular behavior, then you're not going to secure justice. And even if it does, if it's a sexual assault, the likelihood is that you're not going to secure justice anyway. It's easier for the justice system to understand when your pet pig is stolen than when your reproductive organs have been violated. And it's a pity. And it really goes back to the fact that women and children were chattel. We were the property of the head of the household, and the head of our households became our husband after we were married. And so what happened to us was no big deal. We were simply property. And we, as society has evolved, and women have come into their own voice, then we've been able to understand that we do have the right to our bodily autonomy, and that we do have the right to consent to anything that happens to our bodies or our property. And we absolutely must have consent in our laws so that that happens. And it works both ways. It's also important for men to be able to understand that they also have the right of consent. We have to make this human right a civil right. And that's what the Consent Awareness Network is doing. We're working with legislators to submit legislation so that the human right of consent becomes a civil right. So that's what we're up to.
Amazing. So this may be a nice segue, unless Nina, you wanted to jump in on something around this kind of question around why not, right? Why do we not have this written into the law? What is the resistance to it, or the fears around it, or the disconnects? And so, Joyce, I know in your book, Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault, on page 10, you go into some of these reasons. And of course, as reason number one, we have kind of the dismissal of sexual assault as no big deal unless violence is actually involved. This one was quite interesting to me as well, because, you do find that when you speak to survivors, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, while it is so important to be addressing sexual assault and sexual violence, often you do hear survivors say that sometimes it was actually the coercive control elements, the feelings of being trapped, of not being able to escape, of not having any autonomy, fear around what might happen to the kids, all these things being used against the woman, that sense of entrapment or being stalked, those sometimes survivors feel that affects them more than even the sexual violation, because it really is terror. It's a reign of terror, basically.
It's the influence that actually determines whether or not you consented. And, when we look at the definition for consent, it's freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by someone with the capacity to reason. Then we can understand that there are 3 F words that should never take place in sex. They're force, fear, and fraud. And then there's an I word, it's incapacity. So no one should ever exploit your incapacity and consider your acquiescence or your assent to be consent. And let me just go a little further to say that there are basically 3 types of agreement that can take place. Consent is only one of 3 of those types of agreement. Assent means agreement on the face of it. So anytime you nod your head and say yes, you're assenting, you're agreeing. But does that mean you're consenting? Not necessarily.
Well, and this is like the Larry Nassar example that you brought up, right?
100%.
Girls. Yeah.
Yes. Also, when you're in fear, you are acquiescing, and that's coercive control, as you mentioned. When you acquiesce to something out of fear. Now, a lot of our laws insist that if you are forced or if you are threatened with force, but what about all the other threats? What about if it's your landlord who's threatening to evict you if you don't pay him off by having a sexual encounter with them? What happens if it's your employer and your ability to continue your employment is at stake? What if it's your acting career, like in the Weinstein case? What are the various fears that can impact, what happens to you and your family, and particularly in a family? Your spouse could have, a very, very significant power differential. They could be a sole provider. And you know that if you're not acquiescing to what they're asking you, what they're demanding from you, that there'll be repercussions, that your family will suffer, your children will suffer. So there are a lot of misuses. And I know you also, have been involved in coercive control within a cult. And oftentimes, cults are based on coercive control. They're based on fear. They're based on fear of many things that might not have to do with whether someone's going to smack them over the head with a 2x4.
Yeah.
And so if you're in fear, then you're not freely giving your agreement. And so when we look at consent as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement, by a person who has the capacity to reason, then you know that force, fear, fraud, or exploiting someone's incapacity should never be considered consent. And we have to have laws that support that in order for us to actually secure the kind of justice that survivors deserve and hold people accountable.
I wanted to point out, to add to what Joyce just said, is mostly in our laws, the way that legal language deals with coercion is by saying that it's forcible compulsion. Yeah. So, that means, what Joyce was saying, I'm going to hit you on the head with a 2x4, but it does not deal with coercion as we know it through coercive control. So that's just another issue with our laws that defining consent would cover.
Yeah. What would you say, the other element that I'm so glad you touched on this, Joyce, in terms of the history of women as property and chattel. But I thought it was also very interesting, when you really kind of think about this as a whole, from a historical standpoint, we truly are just getting used to women having equal rights.
We don't even have the Equal Rights Amendment yet.
So, yeah, I'm sorry. I always say that reasonable people of goodwill, now understand intrinsically, organically, that every individual, no matter what your race, ethnicity, gender, sex, citizenship, every individual deserves the rights to their bodily autonomy and personal agency. And we need to bring our laws into the 21st century to be in accord with these human rights understandings.
I love that. And I love, Joyce, you also say something, you make some reference about morality gets kind of defined by the laws, that we rise up when we hold morality in our laws.
Exactly.
I know I'm not saying that as eloquently as you would, so please.
It wasn't me, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Yeah. And basically she said that society creates our morals, right? But also our laws create our morals, right? And society needs to demand the laws that are consistent with our morals. And if we don't do that, then how do we possibly, we see this all the time, and Nina and I sometimes roll our eyes when we see stuff coming out about teaching kids and teaching young adults and people in college campuses what consent means, because there is no support for what they're being told. First of all, a lot of what they're being told is that words and actions are the determining factor in whether or not you consented. And that's just blasphemously inaccurate. What determines whether or not you consented is what influenced you to comply. Because if you were maliciously influenced, then you can't possibly be consenting, because consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. So I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but that's what it is. And even when you look at what goes on in creating our laws and in our justice system, we have a very, very highly respected organization called the American Law Institute that has that we've almost come to blows with over, what should constitute consent in our laws. And they recently passed more ridiculous, convoluted nonsense that undermines, what actually should be there. And I had this conversation with Dr. Stephen Schulhofer from New York University. And he had sent me a treatise that he had written and presented in Germany that identifies that consent is both attitudinal and behavioral. I agree with him on its attitudinal. However, what they don't grasp is that there is a noun called consent and there is a verb called to consent, right? So the to consent verb means to convey consent to another. But unless you're actually consenting, the noun form, freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement, then no matter what your words and actions and your behavior is, you can't be conveying consent to another if consent never existed in the first place. And yet, in our laws today, the focus is on what you say, what you do, and how you're conveying in your behavior or in your words. And that's just completely superficial. It's not about what you say and what you do. It's about what influenced you to say and do whatever you said and whatever you did.
Yeah,
because they're undermining your agency by using force, fear, fraud, or by exploiting your incapacity. Because I get this business that pushback about, well, what about a woman's agency? Aren't you blah, blah, blah? No, you can't undermine her agency through force, fear, fraud, or by exploiting her incapacity. And I always get you're just a feminist. No. Excuse me. It goes both ways. You can't do it to a man either, right? Men, women, we all have the right to consent. It's a human right, and we need to make it a civil right.
I wanted to point out, to add to Joyce's points, directly addressing the coercive control in cults and high groups of high expectation with the story of NXIVM. When we spoke to our friends at A Little Bit Culty, the NXIVM whistleblowers, Sarah Edmondson and Nippy Ames, we discussed the branding issue that Sarah had to endure. And there's actually audio of Keith Raniere, the leader, speaking with, I guess, his chief of staff, Allison Mack, about how they were going to handle the consent issue with regard to the branding so as to protect them. Yes. And Keith came up with something like, well, let's have them say something like, Master, please brand me. It will be an honor, which each of the individuals were instructed to say. And he said, that's going to get rid of the consent issue. And we're going to be in the clear, if you will. And so that's just something I wanted to bring up with regard to coercive control and cults, that they maintain, and their leaders maintain, that all they have to do is elicit a yes or compliance. And they consider that consent, or more to the point, they use that as a means by which to say in the future, well, this person stayed. This person said yes. This person complied. This person stayed silent. This person went along. And so that's just something that we have to be aware of. This yes means yes nonsense is victim blaming and shaming, because we're looking to the words and the conduct of the victim to determine whether or not a crime has taken place, rather than looking to the behavior of the offender, which is, wherein lies the determination of a crime.
And unfortunately, it's happening all over the world. There are recent laws that have passed that support this blame the victim concept. Alaska just signed into law a words and actions statute. Indiana just signed into law a words and actions standard. Spain just signed it into law. Australia signed it into law. And these people think that they're protecting society. They are not. They're enabling rapists. They don't get it. It's the influence that's wielded over the person in order to get them to comply. And if it's malicious influence, then that person is not consenting. Yeah. And that's really what we need to what we need to define in our laws, that it's the influence. And once you define that in our laws, then you can't go into a courtroom and say, what was she wearing? What was she doing? Did she have sex with, how many people did she have sex with before she had sex with you? Not that you had sex, you had rape, So all of that is the result of not having a correct sense of what consent really means. And that's why it's so important for us to understand it.
So important. And it's so interesting as the two of you are speaking. I was also just thinking kind of this added dimension to the group dynamic. Part of what's interesting about that, I think, and what kind of, can muddy the waters is that, of course, with different individuals, you have different experiences. So I have literally had people who have come out of the same group that I was in. Now, granted, again, I have taken the deepest dive that one can take into studying these things. So I really do understand the dynamics and the tactics and the undue influence. And others may not. But I have literally had conversations. Most people who got out of my group will say they easily identify certain behaviors that were inappropriate, like shunning, things like that, or sitting around a table and exposing people's secrets or their private confessions, that gets exposed in front of others. Things like that, people are able to kind of identify as maybe unhealthy. But it's very interesting to me that one of the things, and you may find this interesting, Nina, that with the military connection, I've also had people kind of say, so I've had people from my group actually state, I knew exactly what I was getting into. I knew what I was committing to. And I knew what I was signing up for. Now, that's just not true.
Well, I agree with that, obviously. And it just goes back to, if you will, the victim blaming and shaming that we place upon ourselves. What we heap upon ourselves in that arena is even far worse than what we experience from society. And one of the messages that I always want to bring to the table here, because I experienced it myself, is the potential for healing. And when you understand the correct definition of consent, you realize that you did not have anything to do with eliciting the abuse that came upon you. And that is, to me, it's very empowering. It's very healing. It sets you straight and so that you can have this understanding about yourself. And I think that it really leads to self-forgiveness. It's a revelation that can promote healing. And I just think that's a very valuable message that we want to get across today, particularly where it involves interpersonal abuse, coercive control, cultic domination. So I think that's just I want to send that message of healing to everyone.
Also, when you have people that undergo the same circumstance, like in a cult, and some people are defending the cult leader, and other people are saying, "What, are you crazy? This is a cult, and I'm getting out." And they're extremely defensive. To a great extent, it really has to do with how people relate to shame. Right? Some people are able to understand and be able to grapple with how they feel about having been victimized. And other people just are adamant that they can't tolerate having been victimized, and they will fight to the death to argue that they weren't victimized. And so people are human. They're all entitled to their defense mechanisms.
That's right.
And oftentimes when you talk to people, from the cult that have remained, and even though they see, the horrors that go on, they just really have a tough time dealing with the shame that they feel, and try to suppress it and bury it.
Yes. And it's interesting. I think the other thing that, I always consider now, just understanding coercive control the way that I do, is watching the patterns and the escalation of things with perpetrators or abusers. And so it's interesting also, Nina, that you brought up the Nexium brand, because of course that was a huge element to the case. And this is something that I have not shared yet publicly, but I did find out that the leader of my group, who is still functioning, of my cult, he actually did something where he told everybody that moles, like dark spots on your skin, that moles are a sign that you are holding on to darkness or negativity. And he decided that they should be removed, but that he would remove them. Now, by my book, that's practicing medicine without a license, but narcissists, sometimes take free license with things like this. And so he had an afternoon where everybody showed up, lined up outside his workshop, and priests stood inside with him. He had this medical device to remove people's moles. They lay down on the table, and apparently if it was extra painful, the priests were holding them down. And young people, who might have a mole under their breast, or, that you're stripping your clothes in order to have this procedure done. And, I don't know if they signed consent forms around that or not, but this is the level of what can transpire when people are under that spell.
Yeah, going back to Nexium with that as well, the doctor who was affiliated with Nexium and who performed the branding, Dr. Danielle Roberts, she lost her medical license, and rightly so. But her argument, and it was very, very vociferous, and talked about women's rights and women have agency. Why can't they tell us what they want? Her argument was that consent was present. And, particularly a physician who doesn't understand consent is especially reprehensible. One of my offenders was a physician. And so, to have that be in place. And also, talking about power differentials, one would have, they would extract a lot more trust and respect, from a physician than they would a layperson. So that's, something that we can consider as well, and we do, which is the power differential.
Yeah, they're playing on the reputation or the trust that goes along with being a doctor. But what's interesting about that is that it goes right back to Nuremberg Code. There are several codes that identify for us what consent actually means. When we go in for our COVID shots, we all stick out our arms for that shot after we sign a consent form. And that consent form results from Nuremberg Code. Back in Nazi Germany, when we had the concentration camps and all the terrible pseudo-medical experiments that were taking place on prisoners, after the war, these folks faced a tribunal called the Nuremberg trials. And in the Nuremberg trials, 21 of them were convicted of war crimes. What resulted was Nuremberg Code. And Nuremberg Code identifies that consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. And so when you sign your consent form, I don't know how many of you actually read it. I read it because of my interest in consent. And I want to see whether that consent form is actually following the dictates of Nuremberg Code. And in fact, anytime I have signed a consent form for my COVID shot, I found that indeed it had. And it's identifying that you have freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement, and that you're not under the influence of anything or anyone, that you're doing it free and clear. So if you were to sign that agreement, but ultimately found out that what they gave you was a allergy shot, they'd be violating your consent, right? That would be a crime, actually, because they had told you one thing and done something else. And so that consent form would be null and void. Even back in canon law, contracts could be nullified if they resulted from fraud, or if they resulted from fear, or if they resulted from force. So this is not something that's new. Our parents teach us consent every day. They teach us, don't hit your baby brother, don't scare your baby brother, don't hit your sister. God forbid you hit your baby brother. But also, don't sign my name to your report card, right? That's up to your parent. That's not up to you. That would be a fraud. We teach them, don't borrow your sister's favorite sweater while she's taking a nap, because she's incapacitated, she's sleeping. So we all know these things. They're practiced in our homes, and it needs to be supported in our laws, because while we're in our homes and in our family as children growing up, our parents enforce those guidelines. But when we get out into the family of man, we don't have our parents sitting over us any longer. We need laws that will hold us accountable. And our laws need to continue the concepts that are passed along to us while we were raised by our families. And
I wanted to point out, to add to the medical consent that we are all familiar with. We have issues with, because they're inaccurate, the way that the word consent is modified, put the adjective on it. And in the medical field, they call it informed consent.
Yes.
Well, there is no uninformed consent, first of all. And then, of course, it's redundant in that consent is freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement. And we see this in all the time.
Circular circle.
Yeah, it's a circular circle. All right, to say that, and that kind of dilutes and diminishes the true definition of consent. And we see all these hashtags, and we find them to be misleading or inaccurate. Like, I don't know, enthusiastic consent is one that, it's, first of all, since we understand that consent is having the same definition, I always say, whether it's in the bedroom, boardroom, operating room, playroom, locker room, war room, okay, to suggest that there's a different definition for sexual consent over consent is misleading, and it confuses people. I don't know. I've been the holder of a couple mortgages, and when I was signing the documents, I was not like, oh yes, absolutely, bring it on. So to put this kind of burden on people and expectation, and Joyce had just pointed out, which I didn't consider, that it's actually a violation of our speech. In other words, that the only kind of consent that we can render has to be this enthusiastic thing with cheerleaders and pom-poms. And that's just what's going on in consent education today.
Yeah.
Is that so much of what people are speaking about in consent education as being, universal truths that we know, like, you can't be drunk, all this kind of stuff. A lot of times it's not backed up in the law. There was a Midwestern state that's just undergoing some changes. I don't know if it was, I think it was Missouri, that basically allowed for a drunken state to not be a consent violation. And so that's why we're saying these things aren't backed up in the law and we're not protected. And that's part of our message. We need to educate and let people know that this is not addressed in the law properly. We're vulnerable and we're unprotected.
In New York, the bill that we were working on with our hero, Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright, actually introduced the bill that defines consent in New York law. And it's currently pending both in the Senate and in the Assembly. And the bill was introduced in general law rather than in sexual assault law, so that it covers sex trafficking, domestic violence. It covers anything and everything, all 162 times that the word consent actually exists in the statutes in New York, because consent is always the same thing. It never changes. And that nonsense about enthusiastic consent, as Nina alluded to, is really a violation of your Second Amendment right to free speech. Not everybody is enthusiastic or wants to demonstrate enthusiasm when they're having sex. That's not something that should be controlled by the state. The state should not be getting into your bedroom with you and telling you how you should speak when you're having sex. So, I can understand that on a college campus, it would be a wonderful thing to encourage people to speak up. But for a law to actually insist that you must speak enthusiastically, that would be really a violation of your Second Amendment right. And it's really got nothing to do with what you say or what you do. It has to do only with what was the influence that got you to say and do it. So let's stop focusing on this nonsense about behavior and start focusing on the reality of malicious intent or not malicious intent. If it was malicious influence and the offender, people don't exert malicious influence as an accident. Let's get this straight. When a person uses malicious influence of force, fear, fraud, or exploiting your incapacity, they know what they're doing. It's not accidental.
I think this is something very difficult for people to understand, especially when you're kind of looking from the outside, and the perpetrators are very charismatic or kind or, well-spoken in certain environments. And it really is such a disconnect for people to understand.
Our laws need to get it straight. Yeah. Our laws need to understand that people can be fooled, tricked, coerced, forced, and you can, somebody is beating you up and you want to say, oh, please use a condom. Okay, because you've given up, you know that your resistance is only getting you more and more harmed. And so you want it over with. You know that in order to make this go away, you have to comply. Well, excuse me, that is not consent. So no matter what you say or what you do, it's whether the influence that got you to say or do it was legal or illegal.
I also wanted to address, and Joyce can elaborate on this, is that so many, well, these states in the United States are trying to address this consent gap, or as Joyce calls it, the Swiss cheese umbrella, by reacting to issues that have been exposed or have trended, if you will, on social media. So because consent is not defined in the law, we have these stopgaps movements and laws being enacted about stealthing, which is non-consensual condom removal. And by the way, stealthing laws don't protect like they say that they should, because they don't include dental dams or the withholding of information about your fertility. So that's an issue that still has a legal loophole. Non-consensual intimate image sharing. which again, if consent were defined, we wouldn't have an issue with that. And by the way, I think there are about 46 states that have laws about that. And if you don't know, I mean, that's what we used to call revenge porn. And they all have the same bad legal language in that the actual crime in, the image posting is not the actual image posting without consent. It's the mindset or the mens rea of the perpetrator. So if we ask the perpetrator, hey, did you mean to harass, embarrass, humiliate the victim? And they say, well, no, I don't know how we can prove that that state of mind existed. We've been working with a woman here in Pennsylvania who brought her ex up on these image sharing charges. And because the defense was, and she couldn't prove otherwise, that he didn't have bad intent about it, the offense was knocked down to a misdemeanor, and he paid a $10 fine, and the images were still left online. So these are the kind of loopholes that happen in when we don't have consent defined. I'd also like to bring up some coercive control initiatives. I've been studying them because that's what happened to me, and it's also very topical. Many of them don't even mention the word consent. Yeah. And we feel very strongly that we can't talk about coercive control unless we talk about consent. And I don't know if there's any other loophole laws. There are certainly so many, and Joyce could probably address them. You want to maybe talk about the Alaska story, which is yikes.
And I think, what I would say to that, Nina, is I agree with you, which is why I had my aha moment and kind of jumped on board with you all. I think the area where it's so important to understand coercive control and have that defined in the law, which of course now it's defined more in the kind of domestic violence law realm, but is really so that people just understand what it is and that it's a pattern and that we know it also has future indicators that if we could detect it and see it and know it and recognize it, we can literally save women's lives.
And families. Yeah, very much so.
Joyce, did you want to, I wonder about just sharing maybe that story, and then maybe we can just wrap it up.
Okay. I think you're referring to the Alaska story. Okay. I've forgotten what his last name is. Schneider is his last name. I've forgotten his first.
Yeah, Schneider.
Yeah. But he had actually, in Alaska, apparently a lot of people hitchhike. It's a very wide spread out. I've had the good fortune of actually visiting Alaska. It's a beautiful state with some pretty ugly laws. And in Alaska, you have a lot of people that really can't afford cars and don't have the greatest public transportation. So a lot of people hitchhike. And a woman encountered a gentleman in a store, like forgotten what they're called, when you stop at the truck stop and you get gas and go in and get a bag of chips and a Coke. She asked this gentleman if she could have a lift. And he agreed. And he took her to a secluded place, strangled her to the extent that she passed out. And when she came to, he had ejaculated on her face. And he was arrested and he was acquitted because in Alaska, ejaculating semen on somebody's face at the time was not a crime. And that's how we got involved with Alaska, because not only that,
but we also element with the strangulation.
One would think, but he was acquitted, and then a legislator got a hold of that story that was in the mainstream news in Alaska, and he actually created a bill that passed in the Senate and the Assembly, and now it's against the law in Alaska, but too late for the victim. But that's what we're saying about, how instead of having this polyurethane coating over this umbrella, we try to create laws for every single horrifying incident that comes along. Well, there are too many of them. There are just infinite ways that you can murder a person, and there are infinite ways that you can sexually assault a person or harm them in any other way. There's no end to it. So what are we going to do? We're going to run to the legislation and try to, after the fact, make a law for this incident or that incident. This is absurd. They're lacking in consent. And if we simply codify what consent is in our laws, then we don't have this problem. And when you get into a trial for a sexual assault or any other kind of law that's impacted by lack of consent, then it's not what the victim did, it's what the offender did in order to influence that person's compliance. And it stops being about what the victim did. And we're not going to stop blaming victims until we start defining consent properly in our laws.
Yeah, because victim blaming is actually, with the words and conduct language, it's actually embedding into our laws victim blaming and shaming. We talk about eradicating that, and it's actually reinforced in our laws. I also wanted to point out, in Alaska, we lobbied very, very strongly against it, but Alaska was very, very pleased to say that their so-called consent definition was modeled very closely after the Uniform Code of Justice, the military's understanding, if you will, about consent, which is incorrect. And we couldn't help but be sadly amused that, they were trying to incorporate this definition from an agency, an institution that has the worst rate of sexual assault, bar none, in the United States, any states. And
even worse than Alaska. And Alaska has the worst rate of rape and sexual assault in any state in the country. Arkansas is next.
Yeah.
And I saw some big article just came out about this as well, just in the past week.
Right, about the military, that the numbers were so much more pronounced than they thought. Right. And of course, these are just the people that report. All right.
And these are the people that they're copying in order to create a new law. And we told them very clearly, no, we're fighting with the military to change their law. Mm-hmm. And we've actually had some success in getting that done. So we're still working on it and intend to bring that forward, particularly after the revelation 2 days ago that the rate of sexual assault in the military is up 38% against women, and I think doubled against men. Mm-hmm. And so, but legislators don't want to be the first to the table. They want to get reelected, and they need to feel that their constituent base is behind them. And that's why it's so important for people that are watching this video or listening to this podcast to listen to our TEDx talk, read the book, get knowledge about what consent really is, call your legislator, demand change. We have to change the narrative for these legislators. We have to get them to understand if they do nothing, they're not going to get reelected. If they do something, we'll support them. And right now, their concept is just the opposite. If they ignore it, it'll go away. If they ignore it, nobody's going to be angry that they're taking a stand on this thing that may lose parts of their constituency.
So may I ask, Joyce, because it's very interesting, all these stats are coming out really just over the past few days where we're seeing kind of people come out in numbers that we've never seen before because of women voting Roe v. Wade. And I wondered, as I received that news, if this is part of this swell, that we need of people
100%.
really paying attention.
100%, because there is a tremendous intersection between Roe and sexual assault. It's all about consent. It's all about that woman's autonomy over her body. And doesn't she have the right to consent to the use of her reproductive organs? This is, there are three basic important elements for every human being. It's part of our existence. The first one is you have nurturing, right? You have to eat. You have to nurture yourself. If you don't eat, you don't live. And so finding food, getting food, creating nurturing for your family is uppermost in just being a human being. Another one is protection, because if you're out there with the wolves and the tigers and the bears, you're not going to live either. And the third is the preservation of our species. And that has to do with our reproductive systems. And that's why it's such a terrible violation to a person to have someone other than themselves controlling their reproductive systems, because it's an innate element in who you are as a human being. And no one has the right to undermine your self-determination over your reproductive organs, not to impregnate you, and not to insist that you carry a pregnancy to term. It's all part of and parcel of the same thing. And we need our laws to recognize that. Susan B. Anthony lived for, Susan B. Anthony struggled for 50 years in order for us to have the right to vote. And we've only had the right to vote for a little bit more than 100 years. So we've gone through century after century after century without any recognition of our rights. And so what you mentioned before, Jennifer, was very true. We're only coming into our rights very recently. And Susan B. Anthony actually died 15 years before women got the right to vote. And I certainly pray, and I hope that through the current technology that we have today and the sharing of information that we have today and the communication that we have today, that it won't take us 50 years of struggle in order to define consent in our laws. Just think of all the human beings that are harmed as a result. And it isn't solely for this generation. When you are giving birth to the product of rape, that affects that child, and it affects all future generations. Another example is, look at the Eve Wiley is another one of our another person who's been very supportive of our efforts in Texas. And Eve is the product of artificial insemination, where her mother was artificially inseminated by a doctor who swapped the sperm for someone other than the person that she had selected, or the person he told her he was going to implant in her body. And that doesn't just affect Eve, but she has children, and there are people all around her that may be her brothers, or maybe her sisters, or maybe their uncle or their aunt or their cousins. In Indiana, this happened with a Dr. Klein, Donald Klein, and they estimate 90 offspring in Indianapolis. Give me a break. I mean, these people can be dating each other. Who knows?
And this is also, this particular case, I do believe, they just did a Netflix documentary called Our Father, I believe. Yeah. So for people interested in that, to really understand kind of the survivor impact of that. I mean. Yeah.
And Eve Wiley's story is coming out, I believe, it might even be tonight.
Oh.
that they have a documentary that they've recently done.
She's done many appearances, and she's been a great force in changing the law.
They have 10 states now that have adopted the law of the fertility law as it relates to implantation.
Mm-hmm. And again, if consent were defined in the law, there'd be more of an understanding and perhaps could have led to prevention. So we're really pleased with Eve's work, but these doctors, their one of their defenses is that, well, they agreed to artificial insemination.
Yeah, and they're defying the Nuremberg Code. Nuremberg Code says freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And their Hippocratic Oath says don't do any harm, right?
Yeah. Well, I can speak about doctors and their ideas and their lack of humility.
Yeah. So certainly, getting folks to get on the consent train is really so important. These legislators need to know we mean business. Just like suffragettes went out in the street and stomped and yelled and screamed and made noise. We need to make noise and let these legislators know we're not going to vote for you unless you define consent in our laws.
And I'll do another little shout out, Joyce, for the suffragettes, and please, women and young women who want to know about our history and what's gotten us here. There's an incredible film called Iron Jaw Maiden. And Hilary Swank plays one of the main suffragette characters. And I apologize that I can't remember all of their names any longer. You would definitely know some of the names, but it really is the story of what these women went through to pass legislation for all of us. I mean, it is just incredible. And even what they endured, because of how much they believed. So I thank the both of you for being a part of that legacy and really working to change, consent law for us and to define it. And so happy to be connected to the two of you in this work. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Can I just add a call to action here?
Please.
I'm hoping that you can include links to these in your program notes.
We will.
Again, I would recommend people reading Joyce's book, Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault. It's a pretty quick read. It's about 30 minutes. And then the end of the book discusses how consent is dealt with in every state of the United States and what the problem is with it. I would absolutely watch Joyce's TEDx talk, When Yes Means No, The Truth About Consent. Another thing I would ask for assistance with is we have a bill pending in New York State, Bill A6540A, and that is going to define consent as freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement, and that will go into general law. We have a petition for that, and we're looking for support on the petition. And it doesn't matter where you live, because what's going on is that if we can codify consent properly in New York State, that will be the template. And other lawmakers will be able to look at it and see that was successful, because lawmakers don't want to make, a lot of times, that's why Rebecca Seawright, who introduced the bill, is so brave. Right, because lawmakers don't want to be the first. And also lawmakers end up replicating laws. And if it's a bad law, like the intimate image sharing law, it's replicated 46 times so far. Lastly, I would say we are looking forward to working with you. If you would like some assistance in contacting your state and federal legislators, because we are working on a state level and a federal level as well, we can help with that. You can get in touch with us. DM us, if you will. We're on Instagram. Joyce is at Your Consent, and I am at Stand Firm Voice. Or you can also click onto our website to send a message to us. We know what to do. We can help you. We can have meetings, and we can continue to spread the awareness that we need to codify consent in the law. Also, we have hashtags. Joyce is wearing one. It's hashtag FGKIA. And the other hashtag we're using is codify consent, hashtag codify consent. So speak to people about this, spread the word that we're not protected and that we have a plan to add more protections in the area of consent.
Thank you, Nina. And we will have all those links in the show notes. And in addition to that, actually, because it's on my mind, Joyce, I also sent a family, a mother who was very interested in educating her children. And I know that we talked a little bit about that in terms of the younger generation and those messages that are around their education around consent. So Joyce actually has a video that's on the website.
Cartoon.
I'll put a link to that as well on how to
cartoon.
Yes, cartoon for children.
And it's not about sex, folks. It's about going to the park.
Yeah, in our link, in our link tree, I know in my link tree we have links to all these things. We also have links to podcasts we've appeared on. If people are interested in coercive control and cultic abuse, I suggest that they listen to the podcast we recorded with Sarah Edmondson and Nippy Ames, A Little Bit Culty. We are the bonus episode on season 1. So we go into, additional detail about coercive control and lack of consent in cult abuse.
Thank you so much. And I'll put a link to that as well, because we've had Sarah and Nippy on too, and they're dear colleagues of mine. So excellent. Anything else before we go?
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you both so much. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you. Together we can make the world a safer place. So we're looking forward to working with you.
And so nice to do it together, because sometimes, it's a lot and it's hard.
Making the world a safer place is what we're all about.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode, and please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the season 2 song written by Jaya Suri. And for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.